there! Hey, data lovers! And welcome to another episode of I Love Data Fridays here at the International Data Evaluation Center on the campuses of The Ohio State University. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an episode of I Love Data Fridays. It has been a little bit since I've done an episode of I Love Data Fridays. We've been hard at work here at IDEC, but today I thought it was important to get one out. And today I am going to do a sort of rebroadcast, a re-recording of the IDEC Townhall meeting that we did on Thursday, March 18th of 2021. And here we go. And hey, who's talking data to you? Well, of course, you've got me, Jeff Breimer-Bashore, Director and Co-Principal Investigator here at the International Data Evaluation Center. And as I said, I'm going to be just doing a re-recording of our town hall meeting that we did on March 18th. And this includes the questions that I got from that town hall meeting. I've got them up here on another screen with me, and I will answer those questions. And so you can hear what was said and how I responded to them. So let's get right in it. So first, folks, I want to reassure everyone this year. I know I have been getting a lot of emails and phone calls from out in the field, and everyone's worried about how chaotic this year has been. But I want you to know that reading recovery, the good news is reading recovery still works. I know there was never any doubt about this, but I just want to reaffirm this in your mind with you and your teachers. So I want to show you this first chart here, and we are going to be looking at some data from fall to mid-year for our reading recovery and random sample students. So let me bring up our first set of bars. So this is data from 5 years ago. The dark blue bar is random sample data. The light blue bar is our reading recovery data. And we're seeing, once again, growth from the start of the year to the middle of the school year. So the bottom of the bar is where kids are starting. Top of the bar is where kids have finished where they are at the middle of the school year. For our reading recovery kids, this is just first round children, both accelerated progress and our recommended children. So in general, you see what we would typically expect to see in these type of data. One, our reading recovery kids are starting much lower than our random sample kids. But by the middle of the school year, they make this accelerated growth and really significantly close that gap between the random sample kids. This is what you would see. This is very typical results. So, for example, if I bring up data from 4 years ago, you can see the bars look practically the same. The amount of growth or the amount of points that they gain stays the same for just about exactly the same for those years. If I bring up another year's worth of data, it's the same two bars. If I bring up another year's worth of data, it's the same two bars over and over again. So this is a hallmark of reading recovery data, that the performance that we get is consistent from year to year to year in what we see. Now, let's bring up this year's first round fall to mid-year data, and let's see how it's changed. So, in general, what you'd see is the biggest difference is that both bars have been pushed down. So the random sample kids are starting lower than the random sample kids from previous years, and this is statistically significant, meaning it's not noise in the data, that it's a real difference. And our reading recovery kids are starting lower than what they were in the previous school year. Once again, statistically significant, which means it's not just noise in the data. But look at the overall results. Once again, reading recovery kids starting way below, but closing that gap on our random sample kids. And so this has got recommended, accelerated progress, and our progressed students in here as well. So the results haven't changed. The bars have just been pushed down a little bit. And I want to point something else out. In the I3 report, one of their findings, and I'm not quoting it exactly, but what they found is that in general, a reading recovery teacher will get more growth out of students who are starting lower. So students who start lower, the teachers will get more growth out of them. And this is, oh my goodness, what did I do there? Let's get back to it. There we go. You can see that typically our kids were getting 131 up to almost 133 points of growth. Your teachers so far this year in the first round are getting 138 points of growth. So they are getting more growth out of their students, all right? Reading recovery is still working. So the other thing I want you guys to do is stop worrying about messy data. Okay? I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. Data are messy every year. Collecting data from schools and doing educational research is an inherently messy thing. There's always going to be messy data. So I wanted to try to find a good metaphor for this for you. I went to visit my oldest daughter down at college this weekend, and she's majoring in art, and she showed me her pictures in an art gallery. Now, this isn't her picture, but I saw this picture, and it spoke to me about data. And you're like, how did it speak to you about data? So this whole picture represents our whole national data set, all right? It's a fairly messy picture. We can see some patterns and pictures in there, but, it's a pretty noisy, messy picture. Your data are right here, okay? If I take that off, notice how your data doesn't stand out at all, okay? So your data don't stand out at all in this messy data or chaotic year this year. It's going to look like regular data like every year. We will see differences in the data, but stop worrying about messy data, all right? It's all good. Just refocus that energy back into supporting students and teachers. All right, so a couple notes about data entry. Sometimes I feel like I'm operating a Catholic confessional, meaning that people will email me or call me and apologize for their data. Please be assured that I am not watching your data personally, all right? Once again, it goes back to this messy data. Stop worrying about it, okay? Everyone's in the same boat this year, all right? So just rechannel that energy. Also, now, I've not encountered any areas where people aren't giving us the real data, but I just want to emphasize to always give us the real data. So, for example, if you've got a child that's got 30 weeks of lessons, make sure that you enter that they got 30 weeks. We want that real data. We want to know how things have changed or shifted or adapted this year. If we don't know, we can't learn from it. And I'm not saying like we're going to hunt people down for mistakes or something or for deviating in some way. We just want to see how things change. We don't know. We can't learn from it. So give us that real data, please. You'll notice that, so some of you have been asking about some of the questions on the website this year. And I just want to tell you that some of the questions are about monitoring the health of the overall intervention in the United States. And they're not really meant for your annual reports. So the questions about, whether the OS was administered in person or remotely, the questions about the number of lessons being split into 3 categories, we're going to report the total number of lessons. We're not going to break it down by the individual, how many remote, standard, or modified lessons that they got. Some of those questions are to help us monitor the overall health of the intervention nationally. Some of you are reporting an extended school year this year, or your school districts are thinking about it. So not a problem. That's fine. Just enter them as you normally would on the IDEC website. My only suggestion is make sure you update the last day of school. So the school district may not issue a formal end date for summer school, or if they don't do that, just pick a date that you know that you're going to be not serving any kids anymore after that date. So it's not critical that it's it's absolutely exactly precise. We use the first day and the last day of school to help compute what round children are served in. So we take that academic year and we break it into thirds. Kids who are in that first part are first round, kids who are in that second part are second round, and kids who are in the last part, the third part, are third round. It just makes sure that we're getting a pretty, that we're having an accurate as possible accounting of what the school year was like this year. So, as an example, let's say, to give you some examples here, let's say we have Malik, and let's say Malik had a program that started in March and finished at the very end of June. You would just record all of the real data for Malik in one record, okay? And that record would reflect his sort of extended program going from March to June. That's fine. Now, let me give you one variation on this. Let's say we do have Malik again. Malik is, let's say he starts in March again. His first record shows him starting in March, but then Malik has a break in his program for more than 3 weeks. It stops for whatever reason in early May, and he doesn't get reading recovery for more than 3 weeks. But then we pick him back up again at the end of May and serve him back into June. So now you can see I have a Malik 1 and a Malik 2. And what I'm trying to say is that if there happens to be a break of more than 3 weeks, we have this 3-week rule here at IDEC. Malik's going to get a second record for himself. So this second record will start over with weeks and lessons at 0, and you'll just retest him on entry and everything, and then you'll just enter the real data for him in records number 1 and number 2. And Malik will have 2 individual records on the website. Another scenario, let's say we have Jasmine who starts in May and goes to June. Jasmine will just have her 1 record that goes from May to June with all of her real lessons and weeks in there as usual. Now, I had a couple questions from our about weeks and everything. So someone had asked, like, what if our extended school is by invitation for our weakest students? Will RR continue for those students able to come to summer school with no lapse in school? So I think what the teacher leader was trying to ask us is if a child started in the fall, they got reading recovery, and then they were invited to actually continue it once again as extended in the summer, that child's going to have 2 lessons, their fall set of lessons, or 2 records, their first record for the lessons they got in the first round in the fall, and then a second record because more than 3 weeks went by for their second set of lessons in the summer. So it's just like Malik, but instead of having Malik starting in March, maybe that was back in October or November for that first one for Malik. All right, let me move on. All right, so we're going to look at the data. We're going to look at this year's data and compare it to last year, and we're going to see what's in the data. All right, a minor disclaimer here, though. Just remember, our data are incomplete, so what I show you today could be different 3 months from now slightly. It could shift around, but I'm giving you the best picture I can at this time. We're going to use these data to help inform our thinking, but like I said, understand that the numbers may shift as more data are entered, all right? So we're going to make a model from it, and we're going to make some predictions a little later. We're going to use it to inform our thinking. This is a lie. I was going to say I'm not going down a data rabbit hole, meaning that I was going to try not to show a bunch of data slides today. I was going to try to keep it to a minimum. I failed, so buckle in, and here we go. And I just want to say, what won't change, though, is that reading recovery still works. So though the data may shift a little bit, the fact that reading recovery still works, that won't change, all right? This is still... I'm willing to stake my name on this one. We will see that reading recovery works. All right, let's talk about fall OS scores. So if you think back to our first chart, we saw that both reading recovery and random sample students saw a drop in their fall OS total scores. And in fact, we saw that same drop repeated through all 6 tasks of the observation survey, and it was statistically significant. So what statistically significant means is that the change that we saw was real, that it wasn't just noise in the data causing the difference, that it is a real change in the data. And it was we saw this statistically significant change in all 6 tasks plus the OS total score. Reading recovery students saw bigger declines overall in their scores. The biggest declines for reading recovery students were in hearing and recording sounds and words, writing vocabulary, and then overall was just a significant decline overall in the total score. So here's just a peek at some averages. So we're showing 2 sets of data, one set of data for a random sample, another set for reading recovery students. For each of these sets, we're showing 2 years of data, 2019-20, and this year's 2021. So you'll see it repeated here again for the reading recovery kids. But in general, as you look vertically down the columns here, for example, for text reading level for random sample students, last year kids were coming in at a text level 6. This year it is about a 4.5. All right, so that drop. And if you look down the columns for these kids, you just see that drop all the way across the table. Same thing with our reading recovery students. Last year, they tended to come in at a text level just above a 1, and now they're coming in below a 1. And you will see this shift, or that drop, all the way across all the scores of the observation survey. Let's talk about lessons, and specifically we're looking at lessons for our first round complete interventions, so accelerated, recommended, and progressed students. Data for last year are up here in the blue bars. Data for this year's first round kids are down here in the orange bar, and we're looking at what percentage of kids got how many lessons. So for example, last year, about almost 20% of our kids, probably 19% of our kids, accelerated kids, got 65 lessons. This year, it's just below 15% of our kids got about 65 lessons. So in general, when you compare blue to orange bars vertically, what happens is that the peak has gotten smaller, or not as tall, and the width of the bars has widened. So this is taller and narrower, and the orange bars are shorter and squatter, essentially. So we have more diversity. We see a greater variation in this year's number of lessons. Another thing that's very interesting, and this goes back to reporting the real data to us, is that we're seeing these little tails here on the ends of our charts, all right? So kids getting more than 100 lessons, 185. I don't know if this is data entry here, but we have some kids recommended who are getting more than 200 lessons. So I called up some teacher leaders and asked, what they might think this is, and they said it's because we're working with kids more than once per day, and we're counting so some school districts are saying they could only work with students 15 minutes at a time. And so they count those 2 lessons as 2 individual, 15-minute. They have 2 15-minute lessons in a day, and they count those 2 lessons as 2 individual lessons. Now, I got a series of questions about this. Some of you have been doing it where you have been counting every time a student gets a lesson, whether it's 15 minutes. If they get 2 15-minute lessons, some of you have been counting those as 2 separate lessons. 2 15-minute lessons in one day. Some of you have been counting lessons, 2 15-minute lessons in one day as 1 lesson. And then some of you have some rules, have come up with your own rules that sort of indicate when you count it as 1 or when you count it as 2. And do we have a national standard? Here is what I'm going to say. I think what is the most important is that you come up with a rule for you and your teachers to follow in your site, because what's most important is you want to be able to clearly interpret your data. So if you can make everybody do it the same way in your site, then your data will make sense to you. Nationally, things just kind of wash out, and it's a different story. So I'm not concerned that everyone is doing it exactly the same way, counting the lessons. Just do it the same way in your site as always, following your own rules there. All right, so what else do we see in our lessons for first round incomplete interventions? So in general, we see that kids who are getting served in the first round, 47% of their lessons are in that sort of standard format where nothing's been modified, like it looks like a reading recovery lessons with no safety modifications. 14% of their lessons have been remote. Now, this is on average. Yours may differ. And 39% of lessons that kids are getting are modified lessons. So in-person lessons, but modified for some sort of safety reasons. Now, we are seeing that the most growth, where the majority of lessons, where there's more than 50% of the lessons, we're seeing the most growth from standard or modified lessons, where the majority of the lessons are either standard or modified. So here is a quick visual representation of that. So once again, we're looking at fall to mid-year growth for our complete interventions, progressed, accelerated progress, and recommended kids. And this is the average growth for the majority of remote kids, the kids who are getting a majority of standard lessons, and kids who are getting a majority of modified lessons. When you do a quick statistical test of where they're starting, you don't find any statistically significant difference, meaning that any small difference you see here is just noise in the data. So essentially we're saying, like, these kids are starting from the same spot. But when you do the test on their end scores, you can see they are statistically significant. So these kids are actually, there is a real difference. They are finishing, they are getting a little more growth. These kids are the majority standard and modified are getting a little bit more growth. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing or something that of concern. Remember, the first grader, our random sample makes 5 months of growth. So all categories of these students are still making accelerated growth. It's just we're getting a little more accelerated growth over here. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, what else do we see in our data? So here we're looking at date of first lesson, and we're looking at data from 2 years again. The blue line is showing data from last year, and the orange line is showing data from first year. So once again, we're looking at our data first lesson for our completed interventions, and we're looking at what percentage, it's a cumulative percentage, what percentage of kids of like when they started, when was their data first lesson. So for example, about 80% of kids last year had started their lessons by the beginning October. This year, 80% of the kids didn't get their lessons started till maybe around the 10th or a little later. So essentially what we're seeing is like about a 5 to 10 day shift to the right on this chart. The kids are starting 5 to 10 days later than what we saw last year. All right, so you guys have been reporting that. Like at the beginning of the school year, you said teachers have been involved with a lot of testing and a lot of other stuff, and you just couldn't start the lessons as early as you normally would. The data are reflecting that. So once again, remember, it goes back to reporting that real data. If we don't know, we can't learn from it. I've learned a lot here. We can see that shift in the first lessons. First round intervention outcomes. So here's it's exciting to see this. So we're looking at kids in the first round, and we're looking at accelerated progress, recommended, and our progressed kids. Now we're looking at 5 years of data, and remember we only have progressed data for just this year. So now some of you are used to seeing that 70%, 30% figure of accelerated progress versus recommended. That's over the entire school year. We're just looking at first round, and that typically is somewhere, if not quite 50-50 to just about a 50-50 split. This year, we're seeing an almost a one-third split, at least in this data. So I don't know if there's anything profound here. This is just how the data looks this year so far, about one-third. So we'll have about in first round, we have about 15% less students making that accelerated progress. That's not bad. These are just what the facts are saying so far. All right, so that's just how the data look this year so far. All right, let's move into reporting for this year. I know you're not even thinking about reporting, but IDEC is really thinking hard about reporting. So reporting, we're not going to try to do any fancy statistics to try and to correct for the shift in dates. So if you remember about 2 charts back, said we can see in the data that people have started about 5 to 10 days later than normal. With one exception, I've just decided that we're going to code any child who started in February and March automatically as second round. February and March are sort of the splitting point. So remember, when our data systems code what round your students were served in, and we do it by splitting your school year into thirds. And February and March is when we start to see the coding of kids starting to be coded as some kids or most of the kids being started coding as third round. A lot of you have been telling me that that you haven't been getting to your second round kids till about March because of that pushback in the start dates. So we're just going to code all February and March kids as second round. And this is important because I'm going to be talking about some changes to your report. And this report spends a lot of time giving you some comparisons of first round and second round kids. And if your second round kids for this year all got coded as third round because of how dates got pushed back, they wouldn't show in your report, or they would be missing from some of the tables. So that's why we're doing it. We're going to use the same reporting style of reporting fall, mid-year, and year-end data. We've used this in our past reports. So just to review how that plays out, for all of our students, whether they start in the fall, mid-year, or a random sample, fall data is always fall data. Year-end data is always year-end data. But for our fall kids, their mid-year data, last year's and past years and this year, will be their exit data. For our kids who started after the mid-year, our second-round kids, their entry data will be their mid-year data. And then, of course, the random sample actually have mid-year data already. So so this is how it's going to be reported, just like in the past. No changes there. We're just going to keep with that. Another change to the reports that we're doing is that we're not going to make annual reports. We'll make annual reports available starting early June. So here is why. In the past, so you're used to getting reports when you click the I'm done button. Our reporting system runs your reports, and then 45 minutes later, you get all your reports. So in the past, in your reports where they got compared to some national data, whether it was random sample data or national reading recovery data, the reports tend to look back, they look back and use data from the previous year because that data set is complete. As you are submitting data for the current school year, that data set's not complete yet. And as we saw way back in our first slide, reading recovery data, the data that we have doesn't really, it hardly changes from year to year. So that's why we usually go back. But this year is not a standard or typical year. This year is a pretty unique year. So we want this year's reports, this year's reports will use national data from this year. So we can do sort of this apples to apples comparison. I think it would be a disservice to try to compare this year's reading recovery students to a previous year's random sample students. It just makes sense to use this year's data. So to that end, we had to figure out when is most of the data in, and how can we keep from delaying the data till, say, the end of the year. So during a typical year, 95% of the data are usually in by early June. So that's why I'm saying in early June we're going to start running reports, because even though it's not 100% in yet, that last 5% of data won't shift our data set in any meaningful manner. Meaning that, let's say you finished your data on June 14th and had your reports run, and then your colleague submitted data on June 30th and had their reports run. It's possible that you may see like a 1/10 of a point difference, like reported on a score when on the national data, on the comparison national data. You could always ask us to rerun it at a later date, and you can then get a full data sets comparison, so it's not a problem. I should have changed this bullet. It's not that you can submit your data anytime before June. Typically, we allow you to start submitting your data to IDEC starting about May 14th. You can still do that. We just won't run your reports until like I said, early June. So if you get it on the 14th and you hit the submit button, a couple weeks is going to go by before we get your report out to you. All right, so as if you needed something new this year to make your life harder, I'm just kidding. It's not going to make your life harder. But we have a new report design that we've been working on. And here's what I'm going to initially tell you about this new report design. You're going to find it familiar, yet just a little different, all right? And so this is how you're going to find it a little different. The tables and figures, most or all of them will contain 3 years of data. So you'll be able to start seeing trends within one report instead of having to go back and look through multiple reports. Most or all of the tables will have national data included in there as a comparison, so you can see how do I compare to national results. And then you will find a slightly updated design of most of the tables and figures, and some of the things in there, you actually, not a radical difference, but some things that were tables in the past, we've switched over to charts because it kind of helps reveal more about the data, and I'll go over more than that in a second. And I'm going to show some examples here in a little bit. But you're like, Jeff, why did you change this year? Well, I've totally borrowed this phrase from Jim Schnug, trainer at Ohio State. We're trying to reinvigorate the questioning of why. Why do we see what we see in our data? So the biggest thing is that we've designed these reports for data investigation, or we redesign these reports for data investigation and not in a way to write your site reports for you. You remember probably past reports have all this supporting text around it that's kind of pre-written text, and some of it may be useful or not. We've taken all that out, and we've really redesigned what we are showing you to help you investigate your data. We've removed some of the data bloat. So how many, I'm not going to ask anyone to raise any hands, but how many of you sighed when you've opened up one of your IDEC site reports and just felt overwhelmed by the number of tables in there? I see you all. So we've trimmed some of the fat, and we've removed some of the data bloat, and we've tried to get down to just some tables and figures that really help us accomplish the third thing below. And that is having data displays that draw your attentions to anomalies in your data. So you want to know why your data are looking different. These tables and new charts can help draw your attention to any possible anomalies in your data. And then this is my big goal. All of the reports that IDEC produces, the UTC, site, districts, and school reports, they all have a similar design. But now that we have this refocusing on the reinvigorating of the questioning of why, I think there's new opportunities to really investigate our data collaboratively. Because, for example, a university report sort of looks at data at a very macro level, seeing big trends and things. They sort of see the forest. And then you guys with your site and districts and school reports, you guys not only see trends in your districts, but you see the trees and what are actually affecting these things. So you guys can work collaborative. Like, we see the big issues in the UTC report. Where do we see them manifest themselves in our other reports? Now, I want you to know that certainly I've had ideas for these reports for years, and certainly you guys may recognize sort of my influence on some of the designs, but I want you to know that I have been working collaboratively with a group of reading recovery professionals, my IDEC advisory committee, and it's made up of 1 teacher, 2 teacher leaders, 3 trainers, a site coordinator, and even a representative from RRCNA. And I certainly come to the group with ideas of like what I think might be good, and then this group looks at it, gives me some great critical feedback, and critiques it, and I'm just so happy. I'll put my name up here, and it's just been a wonderful process to go through and work with this group to tailor a report that takes all of the people from the teacher all the way up to the trainer's advice and perspective into account about how we can make the reports work a little bit harder for us. All right, so here's a few quick examples on our reports. So here's an example of a table 1 that you will see in the report this year. So in this example, it's just reporting the number of schools or districts and schools and teacher leaders and teachers and reading recovery students in a site. And then you'll see 3 columns. There's 1 column for the last 3 years, for 3 years of data. So immediately you can start to see a trend. So for example, here we can see that in those 3 years, we've seen a decrease in the number of students that site is serving. Now, I'm not saying this is profound. I mean, we certainly are worried about that. But you can start to take the temperature of your data. We can start to see this trend. And it's clear that we can see this trend. And this trend plays itself out in the number of schools that are being served, and the number of teachers that are doing reading recovery. So we can see these trends. Here's another example. This is the new table that will be showing your intervention statuses for your reading recovery students. There's 1 row for each intervention status and an overall total. And for all of the intervention status end of program intervention statuses, including our new progressed status. Including our new progressed status right here. You'll see 3 years of data, so you'll see the 3 years up here. For each year, you'll see the number of students that got that intervention status and what percentage it represents. The percentages add up vertically down the column up to 100%. And then finally, over here, we have our national data. So you'll see how it usually breaks. You will see how nationally the percentages break down. So, for example, in this site, back in 16-17, they had, if you round that up to about 45% of their students making accelerated progress. In 17-18, it was about 38% if you round that up. And then in 2018-19, it was back up to about 44%. And nationally, we can see that's about 53%. So now, this doesn't tell us what's wrong or what to fix or what we can start addressing, but we can start to take the temperature of our data and we can start to see trends a little more clearly in our tables. All right, so now let's get down to what my predictions of what the data will look like this year. And I'm going to use all that data that we looked at earlier to try to make some predictions. Now, let me offer this little caveat. All models are wrong, some are useful, and this was said by British statistician George Box in 1976. Now, in statistics, you make models to help you make predictions, and no model is ever 100% right, but some models are useful. So hopefully, the data we saw before that'll help sort of make this mental model in our mind, hopefully we will find this useful, but some of the predictions I have here will certainly be a little bit wrong. So that's just how it is. All right. So I think we're going to see a drop in students served per teacher this year. So you're like, Jeff, that's kind of a weird way to say something. And initially I was going to say we were going to see a drop in the overall students served this year. But we've been seeing that trend for many years. What I think we're going to see is instead of teachers serving 7 to 8 students this year, it's probably going to be around 5 or 6 students. I think we're going to see the number of students served per teacher drop this year because people are being pulled away to do different things. I think we're going to see more, you're going to see in your data more lessons per week. It will show up a little bit nationally, like we might see a 1/10 of a point tick up, or 1/10 or 2 tick up, but I think it will reveal itself more profoundly down in your, especially in your districts and school reports, also in your site reports, but especially at the school level. So I think those will reveal itself down at the more micro or school levels. We're going to see 20% less students coded as accelerated progress. But this is not a criticism. This is just a natural fact that we've added a new category this year, progressed. And remember, these progressed and recommended students, they usually make accelerated progress, or some of them do. So remember, just because they aren't coded as accelerated progress, they might have actually made like actual accelerated progress. So be ready to talk about it like that with your data. And then I think we're going to see, in a lot of cases, slightly more growth from our children. We're going to go back and see what they found in that I3 report, that when presented with a challenge, our reading recovery teachers rise to the challenge. And I think we'll see more growth in our accelerated progress children. We might see more growth in our recommended and our progressed as well. But I think it will particularly manifest itself in the accelerated progress kids. All right, so let's talk about your narrative for like reporting to stakeholders this year. So let's just remember a fact, all right? We talked about data, our data this year. Everyone's data are a mess this year, all right? So remember, we're going to reinvest that energy, stop worrying about messy data, and reinvest it into supporting our teachers and kids, all right? As I say, everyone's data is a mess this year. Welcome to the club. It is so good to see you. I am glad you are here. So our narrative is not going to be lessons were a mess, schools were a mess, kids were a mess, my data are a mess. No, this is not our narrative for this year. Everyone already knows this. Our narrative for this year is, despite all the challenges this year, look at the progress our students made. All right? That is our message for this year. Look at the progress despite all of the challenges. All right? And if you think about back to that very first chart I showed, how is that not success? Those kids making that 138 points of growth. You guys are doing it. That is, despite the challenges, look at the growth that our children made. All right, so what to report? Obviously, what I'm saying is report that accelerated growth. Highlight that accelerated growth. Trumpet and shout about that accelerated growth. Certainly talk about your successes. Point out where you've succeeded. But I would encourage you to share a few blemishes and talk about a plan to address those blemishes. Now, when I say blemishes, and I'm going to go into a little bit more, I'm not talking about something where something really bad happened. I'm just saying where I think if you see a place where you can improve in your data, talk about that and highlight that and tell you how you're going to fix it. I mean, and specifically also talk about what did you learn this year? How did your teachers innovate to overcome problems? How did they change lessons? I mean, talk about that. What are you going to do in OPD to address what you've learned? I've been living by the motto this year, never let a good crisis go to waste. And really, I think the heart of what that little saying is trying to say is that crisis can create opportunity through disruption. So talk about how you found opportunity in the disruption, all right? Now, I want to point out, one bullet on here talks about data, 3 bullets do not. So 3/4 of what I talked about here had nothing to do with data. So I want you to know that a lot of what you might be reporting this year may not have to do with actual student outcomes or data. It's about what you guys actually did, all right? So I just wanted to make that point. So why would I want to talk about blemishes and what blemishes can I report? So let's talk about the why. So I think the first thing about why is that the why, when you talk about a blemish, when you share something, and admittingly, you've got to be a little vulnerable about this, is that it shows that you want to take ownership of this. Like, we had these successes, but look where we slipped up just a little bit. And we own that. And I think through that ownership, it shows like dedication. You can talk about how you and your teachers are dedicated to trying to fix what you see. And it's this willingness not to accept good enough. Like, we're not going to say, well, gosh darn it, we tried, but oh well. No, we're not going to accept that good enough, okay? So we can talk about it in these blemishes. So it's this ownership and this dedication and this willingness not to accept good enough that, yes, your audience will remember your successes, but what they're really going to remember is the passion and this willingness to not accept good enough. And that is what they're going to take away from it. They're like, gosh darn it, they did a great job, but you know what? They're going to do even better next year. That's what we want our audience to remember. Now, just make sure it's a minor blemish, all right? So I'm not saying pick the most catastrophic thing in your data. I'm saying find that low-hanging fruit that you actually think that you can address and really work on for next year. So here is something maybe is like a real world example. This is an example of another table that you're going to be getting this year. And we're looking at first round recommended students by different text level scenarios. All right. I'm not going to explain the whole table, but I'm going to focus on this first row. And these are recommended students who finished at a 5 or below at the middle of the school year. In this site, in 2016-17, they had 18 students that finished at a 5 or below. This comprised 39% of their recommended students. The next year, it jumped up to 34, and that percentage jumped up to 54% of their students. And then finally, in the last year, it was 59% of their students. Nationally, you would expect to see about 38% of students finish out at 5 or below. So we saw one year, they're sort of like where you would expect a typical site to be, but then it jumped up. This is a blemish that you can try to address and make a plan to talk about, and you can even share with your constituents. You can tell them that through, not only are you going to, how are we going to address this? We have data on these kids, and you have data through IDEC and numerous reports, and you're running records, and we can follow them and, learn from whatever we didn't do in our lessons. You can hear me having trouble talking about it because I'm not a reading recovery teacher or teacher leader, but you can see how this data can help us share a little blemish with ourselves. You can also use examples instead of scores. Once again, trainer Jim Schnug really loves to do this. He loves to show examples of text reading level instead of saying the text level child started here and couldn't read this at a text level 1 and made it to a 10. Here he's showing what a child couldn't read at the start and what they finished were able to read at the end of the program. And for those who are not literacy experts like yourself, I mean, I'm included, this seems like a success. I mean, this is a success. I'm not even saying this isn't a success. I remember I went to watch a student with a teacher leader in her lesson, and the teacher leader was saying that she was probably going to end up recommending the student. But as I was listening to him read, to me, he sounded like a proficient reader. I mean, I don't know the subtleties. So use examples sometimes and instead of scores. Whew. All right, we're getting close, folks. Let me do a quick review here. So in review, keep up the awesome work. You guys, you're doing great. You're killing it this year. And if anyone is feeling bad about themselves, I just show them the data that I showed you. You are really doing a great job. Give us the real data. Just make sure you're always giving us that real data. You can see that I'm already learning from your real data. It provides an excellent way to tell a story. I love learning about it. So give us that real data. It will help you. Stop worrying about messy data. Well, remember, we're all part of the Messy Data Club. It is so good to see you. Welcome. We welcome you with open arms. All right? Just rechannel that energy into supporting your students and your teachers. We're going to have a new I Love Data Fridays. We're going to have new annual reports this year. And in upcoming I Love Data Fridays episodes, I will be going over them exhaustively so you're not just being slapped in the face with a new report design. Annual reports will be available starting early June because remember, we're trying to get as much of the national data set in this year before we start reporting because in the reports this year, we want to use this year's national data to do that apples to apples comparison. And then remember, our narrative this year, despite all the challenges this year, look at the progress our students made. Our narrative. Okay, before I go, if you want a copy of this exact chart that I showed in the beginning, but you want to have it using your data, with your data substituted in the light blue bars, just contact the help desk at idecweb.us, and we can get a copy of this chart. Only takes us about 10 minutes to produce that. And you can show this to your teachers and show them how good they're doing. All right, this is normally where I took questions. I'm just going to check my list here real quick. I answered some of them as I was going along. Someone asked if we were going to make the deadline for this year any earlier. No, we won't. Normally, we try to roll over in early August, and I have no intentions of bumping that up or anything. I don't know about extending it yet, but we're definitely not going to make it any earlier. So plenty of time to get data in for any of those kids who have some extended school years. Just remember, I got questioned a lot about, like, how do I know if I should count something as 2 lessons as 1 lesson or 2 lessons as 2 lessons. If you've already have a set of rules in place where you're saying, I'm doing it this way, just keep doing it that way. Have a set of rules that your teachers can follow because then everybody will be doing it the same. And then when you get your reports, it will make sense in your report. Up at the national level, everything kind of just all washes out and it won't really matter too much to us. All right, I'm going to quickly look through my list of questions here. Just looking. And I think that's it. I think I covered... Oh, someone asked me, like, can I please review the difference between progressed and recommended? Does recommended mean only kids who are special ed or Title I? Is there a certain amount of growth that a child makes, progressed versus recommended? So guys, I'm totally going to say I might get this a little bit wrong, but always you can go back and consult your trainer on this, and please do. But from what I remember that was published back at the start of the school year and over the summer, the criteria for the difference between recommended and progressed is not like a score or a cut score or a specific set that the child was going into special ed or Title I. It's about their literacy processing characteristics. So in that document that was sent out from the North American Trainers Group, it pretty exhaustively tries to explain, like, what are the different characteristics of the kids in those groups. And I don't know what the growth... Well, I haven't computed it yet. I could do it right now, but I didn't do it for this video. I don't know what the growth, like what the difference in growth is. And so this year, when we close out the school year, we're going to learn more about the difference between progressed and recommended. And it's not so much that we're going to come up with the cut score criteria. It still needs to be that what are the children's literacy processing characteristics. So I don't have that to stare. So go back to that document, look at what the characteristics are, and that's going to be the real difference between our progressed and our recommended students. All right, everyone. So let me cue some outro music here real quick. Give me 1 second. And here we go. Oh, there we go. Now I hear it going. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will say thank you for watching this episode of I Love Data Fridays. It was so good to see everyone yesterday at the town hall meeting. Sorry if my voice sounds a little hoarse. I've been talking for 2 hours straight, town hall meeting, and then this. So I'm ready for a rest. But as I always say, hey, we will talk data to you later.